The question came out like a man asking a burning room if anyone had water. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Trent stood at the center of the Tactical Operations Room at Joint Operational Command, Fort Liberty, North Carolina, and he looked at 22 people who could not give him what he needed. "Any snipers?" he said. "Anyone." The words fell into the silence like stones dropped into deep water, and nothing came back up. They had lost 3 in 48 hours. 2 to hostile fire during an insertion that turned wrong before dawn on Thursday, and 1 to a medical emergency during the exfil window on Friday morning. The unit's entire certified precision shooter contingent was gone. The mission wasn't finished. The threat was still active, and the clock on the window above the primary display screen read 4 hours and 18 minutes remaining. At the back of the room, at a desk she had occupied for 72 hours without anyone once addressing her by name, a woman sat very still. She had 3 screens open in front of her and a cold cup of coffee she had not touched in 4 hours. She was attached to the intelligence support cell as a data analyst. That was what the badge on her lanyard said. That was the only thing anyone in this room knew about her. Lieutenant Colonel Trent had never looked in her direction, not once in 3 days. If you are watching this right now, drop a comment and tell us where you are. Because you are about to watch what happens when the person that everyone in a room has looked past for 3 straight days turns out to be the only one who can end it. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like, because this story is just getting started, and the next few minutes are going to change the way you think about who is actually in the room with you. Her name was Sergeant First Class Deja Whitmore, and she had been in that operations center since Monday at 0600. She had arrived with 3 other personnel from the intelligence support cell, had been assigned the corner workstation closest to the secondary communications bank, and had set up her equipment with the efficiency of someone who had learned a long time ago how to disappear into a room full of people who were not looking for her. She had introduced herself once, quietly, to the desk officer who processed her access credentials, and had not offered her name to anyone since. She did not eat meals in the break room. She did not join the informal briefings that formed around the coffee station every 3 hours. She sat at her workstation and she worked, and she was invisible, and this was not an accident. She had arranged her 3 screens so that the outermost one, angled slightly toward the room, reflected the planning table in its dark border when its display was at the right brightness setting. She had been reading the table from her corner all week. She had been reading the room all week. No one had noticed because no one had been looking at her screen, and no one had been looking at her screen because they had decided without investigation that what was on it was not relevant to them. She had made that decision easy for them. She was very good at making that decision easy for people. The Tactical Operations Center at Fort Liberty was a large, climate-controlled room with 11 active display screens along 3 walls, 2 central planning tables covered in laminated terrain maps, a row of communication stations along the north wall, and 43 pieces of equipment that required continuous monitoring. It housed, at peak staffing, 28 personnel from 3 different units. In the 72 hours that Sergeant First Class Whitmore had been present, she had mapped every person in the room by function, communication pattern, and expertise gap. This was not something she had been asked to do. It was something she could not stop herself from doing. The way a carpenter's hand finds the grain of any wood it touches, automatic and precise and without effort. She knew which station officer went quiet when he was uncertain and loud when he was covering the uncertainty. She knew which communications tech ran her confirmations 30 seconds late on average, and why. A habit of double-checking that was a strength in peacetime and a liability in a compressed window. She knew where the room's decision-making actually happened, which was not at the planning table where it was performed, but in the 2-minute conversations near the secondary comms bank when Trent stepped out to take calls. She had been accumulating this knowledge for 3 days, and she had not once been asked what she knew. She had noticed, on the first morning, that the ballistics estimation worksheet on the primary planning table contained an error in the wind correction formula for ranges above 900 meters. She had not said anything. She had noted the grid reference where the error would matter most and had stored it, filed it in the same quiet place where she stored everything that she was not asked about. She had noticed, on the second morning, that the communications officer's routing protocol for the Eastern Grid had a redundancy gap that would create a dead window between 1140 and 1153 during any operation that ran through that sector. She had not said anything about that either. She watched. She calculated. She stayed at her desk. She was very good at staying at her desk. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Trent had been commanding this unit for 11 months. He was 47 years old, a graduate of the Special Warfare Center and school, a veteran of 2 combat rotations in Afghanistan and 1 advisory mission in the Horn of Africa. He carried his record the way some men carry a weapon, visible, slightly forward, always in the room before he was. He entered the operations center each morning at 0700, and the room adjusted to his presence the way iron filings adjust to a magnet. Every head turned, every posture shifted, every informal conversation tightened. He was not incompetent. That was the important thing, and it cannot be overstated. He was, by any objective measure, a skilled and decorated commander. He simply could not conceive of a room in which he was not the most capable person present. This was not arrogance in the simple sense. It was something more structural than that. It was the architecture of how he understood himself, and it had never, in 11 months of command, been genuinely tested. He ran meetings the way certain men run meetings, standing when others sat, moving when others were still, never letting the physical space of the room belong to anyone else for long. He had been decorated 4 times, and he wore the weight of those decorations as a kind of argument, a preemptive case for authority that he made with his posture before he ever opened his mouth. He was not a bad commander. That was the thing that made the next 4 days possible. If he had been bad at his job, the room would have discounted him early and looked for other sources of judgment. He was good enough that the room trusted him completely and trusted him long past the point where that trust was warranted. He had walked past Deja Whitmore's workstation 12 times in 3 days. On the first pass, he had glanced at her screens without slowing down and said nothing. On the 6th pass, he had told his operations officer, loud enough to carry across the planning table, that the intel cell needed to produce something actionable by end of day, or he would request a replacement team. He had not addressed Deja directly. He had not looked at her screens long enough to see what was actually on them. She was an analyst. She was support. She was background. He had decided this without examining the evidence, the way a man decides the furniture is not worth noticing, because examining the evidence would require acknowledging that something in the room had not yet been fully assessed. Sergeant Major Calvin Reed had arrived at the operations center on Tuesday afternoon, attached as a senior advisor to the mission planning team. He was 51 years old, 22 years of service, and he had the particular stillness of a man who had long ago stopped needing to prove anything to anyone in any room. He had recognized Deja Whitmore within 4 minutes of walking through the door, not from memory alone, though he had served alongside her, briefly, 6 years earlier at a joint training rotation at Eglin Air Force Base, but from the way she sat, the way she processed the room. There was a posture that certain operators develop after years of training themselves to read environments under pressure, a posture that looks exactly like passivity to anyone who does not know what they are seeing, and looks exactly like absolute readiness to anyone who does. Reed had seen it the moment he walked in. He had said nothing. He had taken his position near the communications bank, and he had watched. Specialist Amara Osei was 24 years old and had been assigned to the operations center as an intelligent systems technician for 9 months. She was good at her job. Fast, precise, genuinely committed. She had grown up in Atlanta, put herself through community college on a combination of grants and part-time work, scored in the top 8% of her MOS training cohort, and was exactly the kind of person the Army identifies early and rewards with complexity. She had also been 24 for 2 years and had never worked with anyone like Deja Whitmore, which meant she had no framework for understanding what she was actually seeing in that corner workstation. When she noticed the woman from the Intel support cell sitting quietly through full mission plan reviews without contributing, she drew the only conclusion her framework allowed. The analyst was there to process data, not to participate. This was a reasonable conclusion based on available information. It was also completely wrong. The failure was not a failure of intelligence. Osei had more than enough of that. It was a failure of category. She had put the woman in the corner into the only available slot that fit the visible data, and once a person is in a slot, the slot tends to hold them even when the evidence starts to push back. Osei had not been taught to look for precision shooters who looked like data analysts. She had not been taught to look for capability that had chosen to stay silent. Her training had prepared her to find what announced itself. She had not yet learned that the most significant things in any room are frequently the things that do not announce themselves at all. The mission itself had been running for 4 days. A confirmed high-value target, designated Nomad, had been located in a fixed structure approximately 1,200 meters from a viable firing position along the eastern ridge of an isolated valley. The operation had originally been tasked to a 3-person certified precision shooter team with full mission authority. 2 of those shooters had been lost during the Thursday insertion, when the approach route was compromised before the team reached the staging area. The 3rd had been medically evacuated Friday morning following a cardiac event during exfil preparation. By Friday afternoon, the mission was at the point of failure. The 6-hour window was open and narrowing. The target was still in position, and Lieutenant Colonel Trent had spent the previous 4 hours on the phone with 2 commands above him confirming that no qualified replacement shooter could reach the area of operations inside the remaining window. The nearest available asset was a 5-hour drive under ideal road conditions. A helicopter insertion was possible, but would require a 30-minute staging window that did not exist. The contingency had been modeled 3 different ways, and it came back the same 3 different times. There was no external solution that fit inside the clock. Whatever was going to happen in the next 6 hours was going to happen with what was already in the building. Trent had sat with this information for 90 minutes before he did what he had trained his whole career not to do, which was stand in front of a room and admit that he did not have an answer. The operations center had gone quiet in a specific way in the last 90 minutes. Not the quiet of a room that had given up. The quiet of a room in which every person was running the same calculation and arriving at the same result. There were no good options. There were only the options that remained, and those options were getting worse by the hour. Trent had pulled 3 personnel files and reviewed them. 2 communications specialists with standard rifle qualification. 1 aviation support officer who had completed an advanced marksmanship elective during his officer basic course 7 years ago. None of them were within range of the skill set required for a precision engagement at 1,200 meters in variable wind conditions with a narrowing operational window. A shot like that was not a task for a communications specialist. It was a task for someone who had built their entire professional life around that exact problem, under those exact conditions, at that exact range. Trent stood at the center of the planning table, and he looked at the maps, and he looked at the clock on the wall above the primary display screen, and he felt, for the first time in 11 months of command, the specific weight of a situation that was not going to bend to his will no matter how long he stood in front of it. He set his hands flat on the table. He looked up at the room, at 22 people who were watching him, and he said the words that a man in his position says only when there is nothing left to say. Any snipers in this room? Anyone? The question carried everything it needed to carry. The desperation. The formality of asking something he did not expect anyone to answer. The performance of having exhausted every option. The clock read 4 hours and 18 minutes, and from the back of the room, from the corner workstation, where the woman with no name on anyone's lips had been sitting for 72 hours, came a sound, the sound of a chair, moving. She did not stand immediately. That was the first thing the room noticed later, when people started piecing together what they had witnessed. She had pushed back her chair, but she had not stood. She had looked at the screens in front of her for 4 seconds, exactly 4 seconds, which was enough time for every person in the room to turn toward the sound and see the analyst in the corner and begin the particular mathematics of trying to understand what she was doing. And then she stood. She was 5 feet 8 inches tall. She was wearing standard operational dress with no distinguishing unit insignia beyond her rank. She had not said a word in 72 hours. She stood with her hands at her sides, and she looked at Trent from across the length of the planning table, and she did not look away. Trent looked back at her for a long moment. His first instinct, which he did not manage to fully conceal from a room of 22 people trained to read faces, was the particular blankness of a man looking at a piece of furniture that has moved. He did not know her name. He registered her as the analyst from the Intel support cell. He had formed, over 3 days, a complete and entirely inaccurate picture of who she was and what she was capable of, and that picture was now standing across a planning table from him with 22 witnesses present, and he was not yet aware of the specific nature of the problem. He said, "You?" And the single word carried, unintentionally, everything that had been wrong about the way he had run that room for 3 days. She said, "Yes, sir." 2 words. That was all. The room did not move. Osei, at her station 2 desks from the corner, looked at Reed, who was standing near the communications bank. Reed did not look back at Osei. He was watching Deja. His face was entirely neutral. His eyes were not. The particular thing about Calvin Reed in that moment was that he was the only person in the room who was not surprised. He had not been surprised since Tuesday, when he walked in and recognized the posture in the corner workstation. He had been waiting, not for this specific sequence of events, but for the moment when the room ran out of every other option and pointed itself, out of pure necessity, toward what had been sitting in the corner the entire time. Trent said, and the pause before the words was half a second too long for a man who prided himself on pace. "What is your qualification?" He had meant the question to establish control, to run the expected validation process. MOS, certification level, last range date, documentation. Trent believed in process, because process was a system he could manage from the front of the room, and managing systems was what made him feel adequate to the space. Deja said her name first. Sergeant First Class Deja Whitmore. Then she said her MOS code, 11 Golf. Then she said, Special Operations Target Interdiction Course, Fort Bragg, Honor Graduate, Fiscal Year 2019. And then she stopped talking, because those 4 pieces of information were sufficient, and she did not fill silences with words that had no purpose. The room took a moment to process. Most of the personnel in that operations center knew what the Special Operations Target Interdiction Course was. Several of them knew its attrition rate, above 50% in any given class, designed specifically to fail anyone who was not capable of a precision shot at extreme range under adverse conditions. Some of them knew that Honor Graduate was not a participation distinction. It meant she had been the best in her class. For a room full of people who had been running a mission they could not complete because they had no one with this exact capability, the 4 pieces of information arrived the way cold water arrives, on a face that has been too close to something very hot. Osei's first response was doubt. She would admit this later, clearly and without hedging, because she was the kind of person who did not hide from the shape of her own errors. She would say that she had looked at this woman for 3 days and had not seen what was in front of her, and that when the new information landed, she had not opened to it immediately. She had pushed back against it. She leaned toward Kowalski at the next station and said in a low voice, "Does she even know what a Barrett looks like?" Kowalski said nothing. Reed, 12 feet away, heard the question. He turned and looked at Osei with an expression that was not anger, exactly, but was related to it by blood. He did not say anything. He turned back to watch Deja. Trent had recovered his composure by now, which was something he was very skilled at doing. He said, "Walk me through your last confirmed engagement." Process again. Verification. He was doing what commanding officers do when confronted with an unexpected variable. Running the checklist. Deja said, "Classified above your current access level, sir." She said it without inflection, without apology, without anything in her voice except the information itself, delivered as a fact and not as a challenge. Trent's jaw set. He was not accustomed to being told what his access level permitted. He was accustomed to determining what other people's access levels permitted. This was a new arrangement, and he did not move through it gracefully. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at his operations officer, Major Dennis Park, who was already pulling her personnel record up on the secondary terminal. Park opened the file. He looked at it. He looked at Trent. He looked at the record again. His expression performed the specific movement that expressions perform when a file contains significantly more than the person expected, and the more arrives in the first 3 seconds. He said, "Sir, I think you need to see this." Trent walked to the terminal. He looked at the screen. He looked at it for 12 seconds. Then he looked back at Deja. And for the first time in 72 hours, he was actually looking at her. Not through her, not past her, not with the peripheral registration of someone cataloging background, but at her, with the full and corrective attention of a man understanding in real time how wrong a 3-day assumption has been. The room was still in the particular way that rooms go still when a specific gravity has shifted and every person present can feel the shift, but no one has named it yet. The clock on the wall read 3 hours and 51 minutes. The target was still in position. The firing window was still narrowing. The 1,200-meter problem was still 1,200 meters under the same northeast wind in the same isolated valley against the same clock. None of that had changed. What had changed was the person standing at the far end of the planning table and the weight she had just acquired in that room, and the only question that was now operationally relevant. Was she going to say yes? Trent came back to the planning table. He had the personnel record open on a tablet now. He set it down face up on the laminated terrain map, which was not something he had planned to do, and which was a kind of acknowledgement that the record made before he could make a deliberate choice about it. He looked at Deja, and he said, "The equipment is staged. Barrett M1 Nolo 7A1, mission configured. Ammunition is on site." He said it the way a man says something when he has understood, very recently, that he is no longer telling. He is asking. Deja looked at the tablet. She looked at the map. She looked at the clock. Then she looked at Trent, and the room waited. She said, "What is the current wind reading at the target grid?" And the room, which had been holding its breath without quite realizing it, exhaled in a particular direction, because that was the right question. That was the only question that mattered at that moment, the variable that would determine every other calculation in the firing solution, and it was not the question that Trent had asked during 4 hours of crisis management, or that Park had asked during 2 hours of contingency review, or that anyone in that room had asked at any point during the planning process. The wind variable at 1,200 meters was the variable that would determine everything, and the woman who had not spoken once in 72 hours had asked it in the first 10 seconds of the first sentence she had ever said in that room. Park looked up the current reading. Northeast at 9 miles per hour. Gusting to 14. She nodded once. She studied the map for 30 seconds without speaking. The room did not move. Trent did not move. The clock read 3 hours and 44 minutes remaining in the window. She looked up from the map. She said, "I will need 20 minutes to build the solution, and I will need someone to pull the familiarization checklist for the M1 Yoni 7A1. Trent looked at Park. Park was already moving toward the equipment locker. And for the first time in 11 months of command in that operations center, Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Trent said the 4 words that he least knew how to say. "What do you need?" She moved to the planning table with the same economy of motion she had applied to every action in the previous 3 days. Nothing wasted. No performance for the room. She set her hands on the edge of the laminated terrain map, and she looked at the operational area in the specific way that a precision shooter looks at a problem. Not at the target, but at the geometry between the firing position and the target. The angles, the elevation change across 1,200 meters, the valley walls creating the wind corridor, the vegetative cover along the approach to the firing position, the sight lines available and unavailable from each potential hide. She was building a 3-dimensional picture in the space between her training and the terrain, and it was a picture that no one else in the room had the architecture to construct. Park had pulled the Barrett M1 Neo 7A1 familiarization checklist from the equipment cabinet and set it on the table beside her. She picked it up, read the first 2 lines, set it face down on the table, and began calling out each checkpoint from memory. Bolt group function check complete. Optics alignment confirmed against sight parameters. Buffer system inspection clear. Rail system integrity confirmed. Magazine feed system check complete. She moved through the 16-point checklist in 91 seconds without looking at the document after the first line. Park followed along on his own copy, checking each point as she called it. When she reached the end, he looked up and went back to recount because he had miscounted. She had not miscounted. She did not wait for him to finish before she moved to the planning table and opened the ballistic calculator. Osei had stopped working. This was notable because Osei was not a person who stopped working. She had been running continuous data pulls since Tuesday morning, and her production record for the week was the highest in the room. But she had stopped, and she was watching the woman at the planning table run a 16-point weapons check from memory without consulting the reference sheet, and she was doing the uncomfortable thing of revising in real time the picture she had assembled over 72 hours. The first version of the picture was simple: analyst, background, support role, no operational relevance. The version now assembling itself in front of her was more complicated, and it required her to look directly at some decisions she had made, including one decision she had made out loud, 12 feet from Sergeant Major Reed, about 7 minutes ago. The firing solution took 19 minutes and 40 seconds to build. She worked through the unit's ballistic calculator at the planning table, entering values with the precision of someone who understood not just what each variable meant, but why it mattered at this specific range and in these specific conditions. 1,200 meters adjusted for terrain. Northeast wind at 9 miles per hour with gust variable of +5. Elevation delta of -31 meters at the target position relative to the firing position. Target structure orientation, providing a 12-inch viable engagement window at the adjusted range. The hold-off correction for the gust variable she identified independently, without prompting, and entered it into the calculator before Park had finished verifying the base values against the unit's standard formula. Park caught the entry. He checked it. It was correct. He did not say anything for a moment. He ran it again, because a value entered before you finished your own baseline verification is either an error or a signal that the person doing the entering is working from a starting point that is further advanced than yours, and Park was a careful man who preferred to know which one it was. He ran it again, and it came back correct again, and he looked at the number, and he looked at where it had come from. And then he looked at the woman who had entered it before he finished his own check, and he said nothing, and he moved to the next value. Reed came to stand beside the planning table, not to help, not to offer input, to be present in the specific way that a man stands beside something he has waited a long time to witness and does not want to witness at a distance. He had not said a word since Deja stood up from her desk. He had watched her receive the qualification question, answer it in 4 pieces of information, watch the room recalibrate, and move to the planning table. He had watched her run the weapons check, and he had watched the room watching her run it. He was watching the particular thing happen that happens in operational rooms when a person reveals competence at a level the room did not expect and cannot dispute. The quality of silence changes. It moves from the silence of uncertainty to the silence of comprehension, and comprehension in a room full of professionals has a weight that is entirely its own. Trent had not stepped back from the table. He had his arms crossed, which was the posture he adopted when he was processing information that was arriving faster than his framework for it. He had commanded enough operations to recognize a firing solution being built correctly. He knew what it looked like. The values she was entering were correct. The corrections were appropriate. The hold-off she had identified independently was precisely the hold-off his best shooters would have identified, had he still had shooters. He was watching someone do the thing he had spent 4 hours hoping someone could do. And the person doing it was the woman he had walked past 12 times in 3 days, without once looking at her screens. He stood at the table, and he processed this, and he did not say anything. She called the final solution aloud when it was complete. Range 1,220 meters adjusted. Wind hold, left 8 minutes of angle. Elevation correction, -4 clicks from 0. Shot timing on gusting cycle. Primary window 4 to 7 seconds from wind peak, secondary window at 12 seconds. She delivered it the way a briefing officer delivers a confirmed finding. Flat, authoritative, complete. Park confirmed each figure against his independent calculator. Every value matched. Every correction fell within expected parameters. He looked up. He said, "Solution confirmed." And the room absorbed this, the way a room absorbs a fact that changes the operational status from mission failed to mission possible in a single exchange. Trent said, "You are confident in this?" He asked it without the performance this time. Just the question, direct. She said, "Yes, sir." And then she said, "I need to go." Because the clock read 3 hours and 2 minutes, and the drive to the firing position was 40 minutes, and equipment staging required 20, and she had not yet said yes to the question that actually mattered. Not the qualification question, and not the solution question, but the operational question, which was whether she would take the shot. She looked at Trent. He looked at the solution on the table. He looked at the clock. He looked at 21 people watching him make a decision that he had not been prepared to make when he walked into the room that morning. He said, "Go." She turned to pick up her kit. Reed fell into step beside her, without being asked and without saying anything. As they moved toward the door, Osei said something, quietly, to no one in particular. She said, "Who is she?" And Kowalski, still watching the door close behind them, said, "I do not know. But she just handed us the only way out of this." Reed heard the question from the hallway. He did not answer it there. He answered it 40 minutes later, in the vehicle, in the measured cadence of a man who has been waiting years to tell a specific story to the right person at the right time. The vehicle was a standard utility transport. 4 seats, Reed driving, and Osei in the passenger seat, because she had asked to go forward with the support element to manage the communications relay, and Trent had approved it without thinking much about it. Deja was in the rear seat, behind the equipment cases. She was not talking. She had not talked since the operations center, and she would not talk again until she was on the ridge with the Barrett in position and the target in the optic. Reed knew this. He had seen it once before, at Eglin, 6 years ago, and he had not forgotten the particular quality of silence that she carried into pre-operation positioning. It was not the silence of someone who had nothing to say. It was the silence of someone who had already said everything that mattered and was now doing the only thing left to do. She was running the problem from the beginning again, the way she always ran problems before an engagement. Not because the solution was uncertain, but because the repetition was part of the preparation, the way a runner does not stop stretching because they are confident they can run. She was checking the geometry of the valley, the wind corridor, the gusting interval. She was timing the 7-second cycle against her own breathing rate. She was building the rhythm in her body that would allow her to take the shot in the exact window the solution required, with one round, cleanly, and come home. Osei said, maybe 5 minutes into the drive, with the direct energy of someone who has decided that pretending not to be curious is a waste of everyone's time. What is her story? Reed kept his eyes on the road. He said, "Which part do you want?" Osei said, "Start at the beginning." Reed said, "She was the top graduate of the Special Operations Target Interdiction course at Fort Bragg, fiscal year 2019. The class started with 22 candidates. 8 finished. She finished first. He said it with the pacing he applied to everything important. One fact, then a pause long enough for the fact to land completely before the next one. Osei let that sit. Then she said, "How long has she been doing this?" Reed said, "She has been a data analyst for 3 years. Before that, she was operational for 6. 2 combat deployments, both with special operations support elements. 11 confirmed long-range engagements across both tours. Her longest confirmed shot was 1,040 meters during her first deployment under combat conditions against a time-sensitive target. 1 shot." He paused. He said, "She has never missed a confirmed engagement in 6 years of operational duty. Not one." Osei was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "So why is she an analyst?" Reed was quiet for a stretch of road. The terrain was closing in on both sides as they approached the ridge access route, the valley walls rising and narrowing the corridor ahead. In the back seat, behind the equipment cases, Deja was not listening, or if she was, nothing in her posture acknowledged it. Reed said, "There was an investigation 3 years ago. A mission went wrong during exfil. Not the precision work. The routing was compromised from above. The team got hit during extraction. 2 casualties. The investigation looked at everything. Her record, her documentation, her decisions in the field. She cooperated fully. She answered every question. And she said nothing about what she knew." He stopped talking for a moment. He looked at the road. Osei said, "What did she know?" Reed said, "She knew who had compromised the routing. She had communications records she had reviewed during the planning phase, records that would have cleared her completely and ended the career of a field-grade officer 3 ranks above her who had made a decision that cost 2 people their lives. She had that documentation. She had reviewed it herself. She understood exactly what it meant and what it would do." He kept his eyes on the road. He said, "She chose not to use it. She accepted the reassignment to intelligence support. She transferred to the analyst role, and she has not said one word in 3 years about what she knows. The 4 men on her team still have their careers. The officer who made the error is still serving. She decided that protecting people was worth more than being vindicated." He paused again. Even when being vindicated would have been very easy and very satisfying. Osei said nothing for a long stretch. She was looking out the passenger window at the terrain moving past, and she was sitting with the information that the woman sitting behind the equipment cases had been given a clear path to being right and had declined to take it because the cost would be paid by people who had not caused the problem. She said, eventually, she could have said something in the room. On day 1, she could have pointed out the ballistics error. On day 2, she could have flagged the comms gap. She could have made sure everyone knew what she was. Reed said, yes. O.C. said, why didn't she? Reed said, because that was not what the mission needed. He let it sit. Then he said, and because after 9 years of this, she knows the difference between what she needs and what the mission needs. The vehicle began the ascent to the ridge staging point. In the rear seat, Deja was running the Barrett through its inspection cycle by feel, her hands moving through the sequence without urgency or hesitation, the same 16-point procedure she had called out from memory 40 minutes ago at the planning table. She did not need to look at her hands. The geometry of the rifle was in her hands the way it gets into hands after years of repetition, so complete that the knowledge has become something other than knowledge, something closer to reflex, or to instinct, or to the thing that exists below both of those and has no word for it in standard use. She had fired this platform at ranges past 1,400 meters in training conditions. She had fired it in wind worse than 9 miles per hour. She had fired it in conditions where the margin was smaller than 12 inches at range. The problem in front of her was a problem she had solved before, more than once, without missing. Precision shooting at extreme range is sometimes described as a purely technical skill, a matter of correct inputs and correct outputs. Variables manage to produce a predictable result. That description is accurate as far as it goes. What it does not account for is the human element in the loop, the breath, the heartbeat, the fraction of a second between the decision to fire and the execution of the fire, the absolute stillness required in that fraction of a second that is not mechanical and cannot be automated. Deja had spent 6 years learning to manage that fraction. It was, in the end, what separated her from the list of people who could not answer Trent's question. Reed said, as the vehicle navigated the final curve before the staging point. She has been in this building for 3 days. He was not really addressing Osai at this point. He was saying it to the road, or to the ridge, or to no one in particular. She has been in that room for 3 days, and she mapped every gap in the plan before the end of Monday, and she fixed the ones she could fix, without anyone noticing she had fixed them. And she sat with the rest, because no one asked her about the rest. He paused. No one ever asks. He said it flatly, without accusation, like a man reporting a weather pattern that has been the same for years. Then he said, and now they asked. The vehicle reached the staging point. He brought it to a stop. In the rear seat, Deja was already moving. Osei got out and stood in the cold air on the ridge approach and watched Deja uncase the Barrett and begin the positioning sequence with the same contained precision she had applied to every action across 3 days in that room. Watching her set the rifle up was watching someone move through a space they had occupied 10,000 times before in training and twice before in combat. There was nothing provisional about any motion. Osei stood for a moment in the cold and watched, and then she said, I said something back in the room. I do not know if she heard it. Reed was beside her. He said, What did you say? Osei looked at the ground. She said, I asked Kowalski if she even knew what a Barrett looked like. Reed said, I know. I heard it. Osei looked at him. He said, So did she. He looked toward the ridge where Deja was in position. He said, She did not look at you. Osei said, I know. Reed said, That is who she is. The communications relay check came through at the top of the hour. Operations center on frequency. All channels confirmed. The target was still in position at the structure. Firing window, 1 hour and 53 minutes remaining. Osei ran the relay confirmation, fed the grid coordinates back to Park at the center, logged the check on her tablet. She was doing her job. Her actual job, the one she was good at, and she was doing it cleanly. Then she heard Deja, 40 meters away on the ridge in her firing position, say one thing into the communications piece. I am in position. The wind at the ridge was reading northeast at 9 miles per hour. The gusting cycle was running on a 7-second interval, consistent with the planned firing solution. The target was in the optic. And then, on the command channel, Trent's voice came through, and Osei heard it, and she understood immediately from the tone and from the word hold that something had shifted in the operations center, and that the thing shifting was not the mission plan. Trent's voice on the command channel was controlled in the particular way that a man's voice is controlled when the control is doing all the work and there is not much underneath it holding it up. He said, "Hold fire, Whitmore." He said, "We have a development at command level." He waited for acknowledgement. She did not acknowledge. Confirmation of a hold order required acknowledgement before the hold was considered received. She did not acknowledge. The channel held open for 4 seconds with nothing on it. Osei looked at Reed. Reed held up one hand, flat, still. He was listening to something on the secondary channel through his earpiece, a channel Osei could not hear. His face did not change. Osei said very quietly, "What is he doing?" Reed said, "He is trying to take it back." He said it without surprise and without heat, the way a person describes something predictable that is nevertheless unfortunate. Trent said, "Whitmore, acknowledge. Hold fire. This is a direct order." The word direct had a specific weight that Trent applied with intention. He used language the same way he used everything, for effect, in front of an audience. The audience in the operations center was 21 people watching their commanding officer issue a direct order to a sniper in a live firing position on the open command channel, with 49 minutes left on the clock. He was performing command authority. He had been performing command authority for 11 months. He could not stop performing it even now, when the performance was the thing most likely to end the mission. Her voice came back on the channel. Flat, completely steady. She said, "Sir, gusting cycle is running on a 7-second interval. I am in the primary window. Wind is at current parameters. Request you hold the channel open for the shot." She did not dispute the order. She did not argue. She gave him the operational information he needed to understand what was happening at 1,200 meters, and she made the one request that kept the mission from failing. The gusting cycle was moving. The window was contracting. 47 minutes on the clock. The primary firing window was now. In the operations center, Park looked at the chronometer on the mission display. He looked at Trent. He said, "Sir." Just the one word. Not an argument. Not a challenge. One word that contained everything it needed to contain. Trent looked at Park. He looked at the display screens. He looked at the channel indicator showing live two-way communication with the ridge firing position. He looked at 20 people who were watching him make a decision. The decision was whether to hold the order and fail the mission or release the order and let a woman he had not looked at for 3 days complete what no one else in the room could complete. He pressed the transmit key. He said, "You have a green light, Whitmore." He said it flat, with nothing decorative in it. The room was quiet. The channel stayed open. The only sounds in the operations center for the next 11 seconds were the ambient hum of 11 display screens, the low electronic undertone of 43 pieces of monitoring equipment, and on the open command channel, the wind at 9 miles per hour against the ridge. One shot, A single report on the site communications feed, sharp and clean and unambiguous, arriving through the open channel like a period at the end of a very long sentence. Then silence. Then her voice, as flat and as steady as it had been at every other moment across 3 days. She said, "Target down, threat neutralized, 1 round expended." Trent's hand came off the transmit key. Park was already logging the confirmation against the mission timestamp. The room did not make a sound. And then it did. Not all at once, but in the particular way that rooms release after something extreme has just resolved, one voice at a time. And then, more. The after-action debrief was scheduled 90 minutes after confirmation of the engagement. In that time, the operations center had reorganized itself. Mission logs being compiled, equipment accounted for, communications records sealed. Brigadier General Patricia Holloway, the commanding general for this operational area, had arrived at the facility 40 minutes after the confirmation call, which meant she had been moving within 15 minutes of the shot, which meant someone with awareness of the mission had called her before the window even closed. She was 61 years old, 33 years of service, and she entered a room in the particular way that some people enter rooms, not loudly, not with announcement, but in a way that the room's center of gravity moved slightly and irreversibly toward her. Trent conducted the debrief summary. He was composed. He had his notes. He covered the mission timeline in sequence. The personnel losses Thursday and Friday, the contingency review, the solution identified. He said, "Working with the available resources in the operations center, we identified a precision engagement capability and executed a confirmed target interdiction at 1,200 meters within the operational window." He said we. He said it twice. The first time it went past without catching on anything visible. The second time, Reed shifted his weight against the wall. Holloway said, "Walk me through the shooter identification process." She had been listening without expression throughout. Trent said the contingency review had identified a qualified operator attached to the intelligence support cell. She said, "Name?" Trent said, "Sergeant First Class Whitmore." He said it with a proprietary register in the word, the way a man references a resource that performed as directed. Holloway wrote something in her notebook. Then she said, "Who built the firing solution?" Trent's pen touched his briefing sheet and did not complete the movement. He said, "The solution was developed collaboratively." That was the word he chose. Collaboratively. Reed said, from his position along the wall, in a voice that carried exactly as far as it needed to carry, and no further. Sergeant First Class Whitmore built the firing solution independently, under 20 minutes, corrected for elevation and wind variable, identified the hold-off offset without prompting. Major Park's independent calculator confirmed every value. It was not collaborative. He said the last 4 words in the same tone as everything before them, which made them land harder, not softer. The room was very still. Trent looked at Reed. Reed looked at Trent with the expression of a man who has chosen this moment and is entirely at peace with the choice. Holloway looked at Park. She said, "Confirm?" Park looked at Trent for exactly 1 second. Then he looked at Holloway, and he said, "Confirmed." The solution was Sergeant First Class Whitmore's. Holloway wrote in her notebook again. She did not look up immediately. She wrote for 6 seconds, and the silence in the operations center during those 6 seconds had a texture that everyone in the room would remember. Trent said nothing. There was nothing to say that fell within the available operational responses. He had the record. 20 people who had watched everything that happened from the moment Deja stood up to the moment the confirmation came back on the channel. And he had the commanding general's notebook, and he had Reed's 4 words still present in the room's air, and he had Park's confirmation. The audience he had spent 11 months performing for was the same audience that had just watched him be corrected in a debrief in front of the commanding general on a fact that was not in dispute by anyone in the room. This was not misfortune. It was the exact architecture of his own choices, assembled one performance at a time across 3 days and 11 months, arriving at one specific moment with his name on it. Holloway closed her notebook. She said, "Thank you, Colonel." She said it the way you say, "thank you," to signal that a portion of a conversation has completed. Then she stood and looked around the room, and her eyes moved to the corner workstation, where the woman who had not spoken for 72 hours and then solved the problem in under 20 minutes was sitting with her hands folded on the desk, the 3 screens in front of her, and a cold cup of coffee she had not touched. Holloway began to walk toward that corner. The room watched her walk. 20 people watched a brigadier general cross a tactical operations center and not stop at the commanding officer's position, not stop at the planning table, not stop at the primary display screens, walk past all of it to the corner desk, to the woman no one had addressed by name. Holloway crossed the operations center with the directness of someone moving toward the thing that matters. She passed the planning table, the communications bank, the row of display screens. She arrived at the corner workstation, and she stopped. She looked at Deja, who looked back at her with the same stillness she had maintained for 3 days. Holloway said, "I heard you asked about the wind." There was a pause. Deja said, "Ma'am." That was the entire exchange. 2 professionals who spoke the same language and did not require additional words to complete the sentence. Holloway held her gaze for a moment. Then she said, "Your operational status is under review as of this afternoon. I have already made the call. By the time you are back at your home station, your file will reflect the change." She said it quietly enough that not every person in the room caught all of it, but the ones close enough to hear understood exactly what was being communicated, and understanding moved through the operations center in the way it moves through rooms of people trained to gather and relay information, fast, without announcement, and complete. Reed, from the wall, allowed himself a single long exhale. He had been carrying something for a long time. He set it down. Deja said, "I was doing my job, ma'am." Holloway said, "Yes, you were," and then some. She said it plainly, without decoration or performance. Then she put out her right hand. Deja stood, and they shook hands. In a room of 22 people, 22 people watched a brigadier general extend her hand to a woman no one had addressed by name for 3 days, and the moment carried the full weight of everything that had come before it. The 72 hours of invisibility, the 12 walk-bys, the word analyst, used the way a word is used when the intent is to make someone smaller than they are. Osei had been watching since Holloway stood up from the debrief table. She watched her cross the room, and she watched the handshake, and she was sitting with the specific discomfort of a person who has been wrong in a particular way for the first time and is now fully inside the understanding of the shape and dimensions of that error. The error was not about whether Deja knew what a Barrett looked like. The error was about what Osei had seen across 3 days, a woman sitting quietly, doing work that no one was asking about, handling everything she handled without announcement, and what Osei had chosen to make of it. The error was in the choosing, and the choosing had been fast and confident and completely without evidence. After Holloway left the room, Osei went to Deja's workstation. She stood there for a moment, and Deja looked up at her. Osei said, "I am sorry for what I said in the room earlier." Deja looked at her for a moment. She said, "I didn't hear it." Maybe she had not. The operations center at peak activity was a room of 43 pieces of monitoring equipment and 11 display screens and 22 personnel generating constant ambient sound, and she had been inside a firing solution for most of the period in question. Or maybe the most skilled person in the room had been skilled enough to understand that some words are best treated as if they were never said, and some people deserve the chance to be different from what they were in a moment of doubt. Osei said, "Thank you anyway." Deja said, "You ran good relay up on the ridge." Osei went back to her station and sat down and did not know quite what to do with that. But she kept it. The operations center finished its decompress in the particular way that rooms decompress after a crisis has resolved. Not with celebration, but with the quiet release of something that has been held extremely tight for an extended period. Equipment was logged and prepped. After-action notes were filed. Mission records were sealed. Reed came to stand near Deja's workstation as she was beginning to shut down her 3 screens. He did not say anything declarative. He did not say, "I knew you could do it," because that would have been small next to what had actually happened. He said, "You good?" She said, "Yeah." He said, "Then let's pack up." She began to shut down the screens. He pulled her equipment case from under the desk. They packed up. There is a specific kind of courage that does not make noise. It does not announce itself on entry. It does not perform for the room it enters. It does not wait for permission or for the right moment or for someone to ask the right question before it reveals what it contains. It simply stays present in the room, doing the work, reading the terrain, building the picture that no one else in the room has asked for, and waiting, with the patience of someone who has always understood that when the mission finally needs what they have, one answer and one shot will be enough. The most dangerous thing about people of genuine skill is how quiet they choose to be. And the most powerful moment in any room is not when the loudest person at the planning table commands the attention of the audience. It is when the person who has been listening for 3 days finally decides to stand up. Deja Whitmore left the operations center at 1700 hours with the same equipment bag she had arrived with Monday morning at 0600. She signed out at the desk officer's station. She walked to the vehicle in the parking area. She drove back to her assigned quarters without stopping. The mission was complete. The threat was neutralized. The window had closed with 51 minutes to spare. She had fired 1 round. She had not missed. She had never missed. This was not a story about a woman who surprised a room. It was a story about a room that had not been paying attention. There is a difference between those two things, and the difference is the entire point.